Hey everyone, Sierra Waters here again with another episode of Too Beautiful to Be Broken. Sorry I've been gone for a couple weeks. Had a few things happen in my life, go on in my life that I needed to take care of, but I'm back every Monday from now on. I hope everyone got a chance to listen to my interview with Lacey. Sex trafficking is much more prevalent right now than we think it is, so I hope everybody got a chance to listen to that. This week, I'm going to kind of go in a different direction, so I hope you'll bear with me. I'm going to have to stand on my soapbox for a minute this week. But first, if anyone needs to contact me, you can reach me at sierra.waters@aol.com, or you can leave me a message at 951-208-4709. I'll respond to any messages that you guys leave for me. If you're in a situation right now that you need help, please make sure you're in a safe location first. Then please reach out to someone that you can trust, a pastor, a friend, a family member, or you can always reach out to me. Leave me a message and I will make sure that I reach back out to you as soon as I get it. So today I'm going to talk about something I feel very strongly about. Pretty off topic for my typical stuff, but still very important. As I told you guys a few weeks ago, I found my biological dad in June this year. I've been spending a lot of this last month getting to know him. A very special time in my life, almost surreal. But when I met him, it was bittersweet, because when I met him, I found out that he has bladder cancer and a lot of other medical issues, which I've since found out are a direct result of his service in the Navy in Vietnam. He's a proud Navy Vietnam veteran. He served 3 tours in Vietnam from 1967 to 1969, and I was conceived between his first and second tours. I've had medical issues my whole life. My kids have had medical issues. My other brothers and sisters and their families have had medical issues off and on our whole lives. But it wasn't until I started talking to my dad that I realized, what our servicemen went through in Vietnam, and honestly, in all the wars that we fought. But in Vietnam in particular, because the United States government used an herbicide mixture that was mixed with dioxin called Agent Orange. Many scientists believe that dioxin, or TCDD, is still the most toxic chemical created by man. So even now, all these years later, they still believe it's the most toxic chemical created by man. They sprayed Agent Orange all over everything in Vietnam. The basic idea was to spray it on the foliage to make the jungles not so thick. They used it in a concentration that was more than 20 times the manufacturer's recommendation in the time period between 1962 and 1972. During that period, they sprayed in excess of 21 million gallons. And this was just not a normal herbicide as we think herbicides are. It would stick to a bush and then eventually, whatever happens to it. This was mixed with petroleum so that it would stick to the leaves and not blow off, and so it would stay on top of the water. There's so many things about this whole entire thing that simply don't sit right with me. So many things that just don't make sense. The first one being Agent Orange was dispersed from airplanes, C-123s, and helicopters all over the countryside and the coast. So how can anyone say that there's anyone in Vietnam that could possibly have not been exposed? The moist mist floated down on every person, not just the soldiers, and not just the soldiers with boots on the ground. There's no one and nowhere in Vietnam or in the area around it that would have been able to escape it. Let me give you a little background here real quick before I continue. Right now, our Blue Water Navy veterans are fighting to get rights and compensation and their benefits for being on boats in Vietnam or ships in Vietnam during this period. Our government is trying to say that they were not exposed to the same chemicals that the soldiers that were boots on the ground were, because they were on ships, not in Vietnam. So that's what I'm talking about here. So the second thing that bothers me is it floated on the water because it was mixed with petroleum, and it floated down the river into the bay and then into the ocean. And, who knows how far it went at that point. Some of the things that I've read say that it stays in the water for 50 plus years. And granted, I'm not a scientist here, but I'm sure if any of the scientists actually looked at the long term effects of, oil spills and these types of things, they have a pretty good idea how long these things last, in the water or in the environment. The water that was on the ships that they used on board for their day-to-day activities was taken from the surrounding waters that the ships were in, and then it was distilled to make it clean to use. Well, if you look at the distillation process that the water went through, a lot of these chemicals were not taken out of the water. And as a matter of fact, from some of what I've looked at, some of the chemicals may have even been enhanced or increased by the process. So I'm not sure if anyone's actually took the time to do the research or sit down or think about it, but I think if they did, they would see the absurdities in the prior conclusions or statements that they've made. Because in essence, what was happening was the sailors on these ships were exposed to Agent Orange and any other agent they were spraying, Agent Blue, Agent Green, whatever it was, every day. It was in the water they drank, it was in the water they cooked in, it was in the water that they bathed in, and it was in the water that they washed their clothes in. So the third thing is they were mixing petroleum with it, which I'm sure made it much more flammable. I mean, as if dioxin and all this stuff wasn't flammable enough as it was. And since they used flamethrowers and napalm bombs in Vietnam, I can only imagine what that created. Then there would obviously be these huge plumes of smoke with these fires that that these things created. So all this stuff would go up into the atmosphere and into the cumulus clouds. Now remember, it still had petroleum mixed with it. So here we have these molecules of this terrible toxic mixture, and it's mixed with petroleum to make it stick to everything, and it's floating around up in the atmosphere above Vietnam. So this is a country that has an annual rainfall of between 70 and 160 inches. So then the toxins fall back down to earth onto these same people again. Okay, so number 4. Here's another issue. As we all well know, when planes fly through things, they're exposed to it. The skins of the airplanes pick up the things that they fly through. The engines pick up the things that they fly through. I mean, that's been proven over and over again with all the things that we hear on the news. So let's look at it this way. We have all these molecules floating around, and our fighter jets are flying through it. And, remember, these aren't regular molecules. They're molecules that have been modified with petroleum to stick. Then they fly back to the carriers and land. The ground crews handle the planes, the pilots climb out of the planes, they walk through the residue, and it goes with them all over the ship. So at this point, I don't think it really matters where you were in Vietnam or how far away your ship was. The exposure's there. We can try to make it about being old or any other excuse that we want to put on it, but the reality of it is that there's a group of men that served this country with pride and dignity, and they fought for this country and under its flag. The men in Vietnam, obeyed orders and honored an oath that they took. Agent Orange was sprayed all over everything. It just was, and anyway, it's not a coincidence by any stretch of imagination that all the men that were in Vietnam, on the ground, on the ships, in every area, suffered for many years with one thing popping up after the other. I've talked to men that were in Vietnam, widows of men that were in Vietnam, you know, women who have men that were in Vietnam, veterans that were sick. And it seems like when they just get one thing under control, then another thing pops up. It's simply unacceptable that we're being so flippant about so many people being affected at the same time. No matter how we try to twist this or make it better, or the connection's obvious. These medical conditions are all related back to the same thing, Agent Orange. And I don't understand why we continue to try to pretend that it isn't really as bad as it is. We pay millions of dollars every year to Vietnam to help the people there that are still suffering. Australia takes care of its own men, but they're having a similar situation. So why is it so hard for the men in charge of our country to see the connection? You know, Agent Orange was sprayed on everything. It was sprayed on the coastlines, sprayed on the the foliage. It was sprayed on the water, and it didn't just float down and land on the the people that were boots on the ground. It floated down and landed on everyone. These little molecules didn't say, you know, oh, they're boots on the ground, let's go over here, or they're, you know, Navy sailors, they're on ships, we have to leave them alone. It didn't pick and choose who it landed on. And it was the same thing when it went up into the cumulus clouds and came back down. The rain didn't say, oops, we have to stay over here for the men that are boots on the ground, and we got to avoid the ships. That's not how it worked. And when the it got in the water and it traveled down the rivers and it went into the bay and out into the ocean, it didn't go to the 12-mile mark and then say, stop, wait a minute, we're at the 12-mile mark, we can't keep going. It went wherever it ended up. And you can't even use that logic when it comes to aircraft carriers and planes that are flying well past the 12-mile mark to land on these carriers. Agent Orange was everywhere, and everyone in Vietnam or around Vietnam was exposed to it, period. I was unable to find out exactly how many C-123s or helicopters went down in the ocean around Vietnam that were carrying Agent Orange, but I looked. And I know from what I looked at that several of them did, but I don't know exactly how many. So I know that it was more than just the Agent Orange that was dropped from these planes that they were exposed to. I know that there was also, Agent Orange that came from, um, you know, planes that crashed. There was so much of it over there that everyone had to have been exposed to it. So when this was over in 1991, the Agent Orange Act of 1991 was passed, and in that particular act, the wording was stated as such: any person serving in any branch of the United States military that was within the Republic of Vietnam was considered to have been exposed to Agent Orange. The Republic of Vietnam was to include the landmass of Vietnam and the 12-mile territorial waters that surrounded it. So that covered everybody. Then in 2002, the Agent Orange Act was amended to read instead boots on the ground. So in that, it denied, any possibility of Navy veterans that served during that same time, you know, any chance of getting the same benefits and compensation as the soldiers that were actually boots on the ground. When I say that right now, just letting those words come out of my mouth sounds completely absurd. There were Navy bases in Vietnam, therefore Navy personnel had boots on the ground. The Navy personnel had liberties. They weren't trapped on the ships, therefore they had boots on the ground. And some of the smaller ships were within the Vietnam waterways. There's it just anyway, aboard the ships there was still the exposure, and for the VA or any other person in this country to say that any of this didn't happen, that they weren't exposed, is simply unfathomable. They sprayed over 21 million gallons of Agent Orange from 1962 to 72. There are so many maps and charts that show exactly where it was sprayed. We know that it was sprayed every day and that it was over the jungles and waterways, the coastlines, and the coast. My dad was on the Edson in 1967 and the St. Paul in 1968. One is a destroyer and one is a cruiser. Those ships, along with other support ships, were in and out of the harbors. And he said that when the planes and helicopters flew over to drop this herbicide, that there was a lot of overspray. He said that when you were standing on the deck when they went over, you could feel the mist coming down on top of you. No one thought about it back then because no one thought that this stuff was that toxic. I mean, we didn't think about asbestos back then either. These men were simply doing the job they were told to do. This was a time during history when men were being drafted, and you had to do 2.5 years of active duty and 1 in the reserves. No one argued it, they simply just did it. And I just found out recently that after Vietnam, these planes were used, the C-123s were used as training planes, until the men and women that were training in them were starting to get sick from the residue. And some of them were taken to museums, to use to show people, what they looked like. Again, until the men and the women around them started getting sick, and then the planes were removed and they were taken to an Air Force base, and every single one of them was destroyed. That shows you how toxic and deadly Agent Orange was. Vietnam was a war that we should never have been involved in. So many men lost their lives in Vietnam, and many, many more have continued to lose their lives every single day. Most of these men are in their early 70s now, and we're losing them at a rate of almost 525 a day now. Our government sent these men to fight a war in unfamiliar territory. We're fighting against a merciless enemy. Our boys were doing as they were told. And at home, things were heating up, and things here were becoming tumultuous. People were protesting the war. It was a time of free love and drugs. Many say that time frame in history was an awakening. I don't know about all that because I was barely born at the time, but I know that our boys came home to being called killers, being ridiculed, confronted, threatened, when they were only following orders. We may not have been fighting for American freedom in Vietnam, but we were fighting for democracy and to stop the spread of communism. And everybody that was over there fought for the United States government and fought underneath its flag. And we have an obligation to the men and women in our armed forces that fight for this country or fight under our flag, to treat them with dignity and to honor them, because the people that live here, and even myself included, we take that freedom that we have for granted every single day. The people in our armed forces and their families sacrifice and put themselves on the line every single solitary day to protect that freedom and to protect democracy and to stop communism from spreading all over this world. And that's what they were doing in Vietnam. Whether we like the war or don't like the war, these young men put their lives on the line to fight for our country. And we owe them a debt of gratitude, and we owe them a thank you, and we owe them the respect and honor for the sacrifice that they made. And I want to take this time to say thank you so much to each and every serviceman that is either currently serving or is a veteran, or to the families of those that have lost someone either in a war or a conflict or when they came home. Purple Heart, recipients, and you know medal, winner, recipients, for the sacrifice that you have made and your families have made, because none of us in this country would enjoy any of the freedoms we have if not for you. We take the sacrifices that you made and continue to make for granted as a country, and we need to change that. This country needs to stand up and stand behind our military, and we need to show them every day how much we thank them for what they've done. And we need to start right now by doing that with our Blue Water veterans, by showing them that the sacrifice that they made in Vietnam and the exposure that they had to this deadly chemical will not go pushed under the rug. It will not go ignored, and that we will stand up and be the country that we are. And we will stand behind these men, and we will show them that we honor the sacrifice that they made. And we will do for them what we should have done for them a long time ago. And we will give them the compensation and the benefits that they so rightly deserve. And for the widows of those men that have lost their lives to diseases created by Agent Orange, I'm sorry. Nobody deserves to go through that. And I hope that as a country we'll stand up and stand behind you, and honor your husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, and do for you what we should have done a long time ago. For now, good night and God bless. Again, if you want to contact me, cr.waters@aol.com. Thank you so much for your time. See you next week.